to the fourth iteration of the Indexing Transformation Seminar Series. It gives me great pleasure, and indeed it's a great honor to be able to welcome Dr. LaShandra Sullivan, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Reed College, to present in our seminar. She completed a dissertation at the University of Chicago in anthropology entitled "The Space to Be Ourselves, Ethnicity, Agribusiness, and Land Conflict in Brazil," which is an ethnography of roadside squatter camps of indigenous and non-indigenous land protesters in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. Sullivan analyzes the emergence of these camps with rural economic development, specifically the mass displacement of rural inhabitants, the casualization of labor, deforestation, and the reorganization of politics in the country in recent decades. She has published several articles on land and identity, on questions of racial justice, and on black invisibility in Brazil. She also worked in Gabon, in West Africa, and wrote an MA thesis on transformations of state and society relations and the built environments in the 1980s that accompanied the petroleum boom in that country. And I'm delighted to be able to invite you to talk about issues surrounding agribusiness and identity at a time in South Africa where once again the land issue has become a major question, with debates in Parliament and in the country about the historical justice for those dispossessed from land in the 19th and 20th centuries in South Africa during colonialism and apartheid, with discussion focused so much in this country on the merits and methods of appropriating land without compensation and giving it back and returning it to black South Africans. So I want to read it, and I invite you to think about Brazil, to think about South Africa, and to listen to this talk, which is entitled "Racial Tethers, Indigenous Land Struggle, and Agribusiness in Brazil." Sullivan, we normally have about 45 to 50 minutes, which you present, and then there'll be about 45 minutes for question time. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here. I felt already very much at home here, not just because of familiar faces, Bernard and Eli, but also the sort of new friendships I think that I'm making, and the wonderful conversations that I've already been a part of. I'd like to especially thank Anne for all of her work for facilitating my visit today. So I will, I would love to audio record. I know this is going to be on video, but for my own purposes, the discussion, because I'm most interested in not just in sharing my ideas, but also hoping to learn from you all here, and hopefully there'll be a lot to talk about, not just in the comparative context, but in other elements and aspects of what I'm discussing today as well. So I hope to learn from you. And if there are any objections to me recording the discussion piece, please let me know. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I'll just dive right in. One day during field work in the center-west region of Brazil, I found myself on the side of a highway, pondering what to make of an unusual request. When Diego asked me for a ride to Amambai to pick up his carteira de trabalho, work permit, and other government-issued documents, my initial reaction was to ask why they were not with him in Dourados. We stood on the side of the highway amidst the ramshackle dwellings that composed the squatter camp protest occupation, where I was conducting dissertation fieldwork. Diego and his fellow protesters are indigenous Guarani people. And I use the term indigenous and Indian, indio is the Portuguese word, throughout this talk and throughout my work, because that's the term that the people that I work with themselves use, right? And as native, indigenous Indian people, as they call themselves. So just to let you know that a little word on the note on the use of terms here. The Guarani squatter camp consists of indigenous land protesters who are insisting on state demarcation of a sugarcane plantation that they are occupying to gain state recognition as their traditional ethnic territory. The protest squatter camp is located on the rural outskirts of the city of Dourados, Mato Grosso do Sul, about a 2-hour drive to Amambai. Diego, dirt poor and without transportation, would have had to have an interesting story to explain how and why his documents ended up 2 hours away in Amambai. I immediately found the situation curious. Diego's initial story made no sense to me. His subsequent versions, after I asked him to explain again and again, further made no sense. Only after traveling with him, retracing a trail of different stops and people, would the pieces of the story begin to come together coherently. They did so only through my accompanying him to Mumbai, tracing backwards through the points at which he had traveled, encountering with him the various strange characters, mostly situated in networks of local strongmen, middlemen between the state, agro-industrial firms, and workers, among whom Diego had lost the documents. Or rather, among whom the documents, and therefore Diego, were being held hostage. The trail turned out to be vast and labyrinthine. The unusual checkpoints and degrees of illegality that Diego had to traverse in order to work presented complicated interconnections with parallel degrees of obfuscation by all involved, including Diego. Presenting and explaining that story here requires laying out how the relations between land, labor, firms, state, and non-governmental actors intersect and operate. It requires situating Diego in these multiple scales of political and economic organization, as his predicament has been created by the reorganization of land and labor in Brazil's contemporary countryside. Over the course of the 20th century, national and international movements in capital and ideas contributed to the radical transformation of the Brazilian countryside. In the center-west state of Mato Grosso do Sul, significant expansion in agribusiness plantations, as well as increasingly technologically sophisticated and capital-intensive production, has displaced formerly rural people into cities, and in the case of indigenous people, crowded them onto reservations. Today, these inhabitants return to the countryside as day laborers, working for misery-level wages. Indigenous laborers provide the majority of manual workers in Mato Grosso do Sul's agricultural sector. Some of these people also return to the countryside as land activists, to reclaim the countryside as a site of political struggle. These activists claim that overcrowding has caused high rates of starvation and violent crime in reservations of Mato Grosso do Sul today, particularly in those reservations bordering cities. Since the late 1980s, there have been protest roadside occupations of agribusiness plantations. Non-Indigenous and Indigenous people alike mobilizing out of urban peripheries and reservations. Since 2007, I've conducted ethnographic fieldwork on these roadsides. Guarani activists, unlike camps of more famous groups like the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Terra, or the Landless Workers Movement, called the MST, the Guarani activists border or enter specific plantations from which they claim they were forcibly displaced and that they consider part of their traditional ethnic territory. Guarani activists do not have a central organization coordinating their protests. Instead, there have been somewhat autonomous uprisings since the late 1980s. Moreover, Guarani groups distinguish themselves from indigenous protesters in regions like the Amazon, who decry encroachments by miners, ranchers, loggers, who creep onto land that already occupied by indigenous groups, like the Kayapo, for example. By contrast, Guarani squatters in Mato Grosso do Sul mobilize on crowded reservations and then move out to the agribusiness installations in the surrounding area. Composed of ramshackle, makeshift housing, protest camps consist of poor people that have moved out of or circulate between urban dwellings and rural work sites. Guarani squatter camps have met often violent opposition by large landholders and their private security forces, including kidnappings, beatings, and dozens of assassinations just since the early 2000s. So I'm going to pause here to share with you some images and give you a sense of where it is that I'm talking about, who are the people that I'm talking about. So this, of course, is Brazil, South America. And where I work is in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, here, bordered by Bolivia and Paraguay. I work in the southern part of the state, and Dorados is roughly there. So here we have Mato Grosso do Sul. Here's Dorados. It's the second largest city in the state, about 250,000 people, more or less. And this is Amambai, where Diego lost his documents. This is, you see Dorados there, right? This is the southern cone of the state. And these are various demarcations from different states. So you see there are small islands of land where indigenous people have been moved out of the surrounding areas and crowded onto these reservations. And they most often border cities. And this has been the case dating back to the 20s when the federal state wanted to better administer these reservations. So they located them right outside of already existing cities. And so you see the different degrees of demarcations. Right? So and the one in Dorados borders the city. And the one in Dorados is the most crowded, and most densely populated indigenous reservation in Brazil. Here's an example of one such squatter camp. You see the dwellings, and you can see right alongside the highway. And in the distance, there's an agribusiness installation. That one is for drying. It's a drying facility. Here's one of the structures. This is the main sort of the largest house in the structure where the leader of the camp lives. And this is where the cooking is done, and they have meetings in front, etc. And you can see it abuts right alongside the plantation, which had already been sort of previously cleared there. But you see it goes right up to the fencing. This is a non-indigenous group camp, squatter camp it's called the Federação de Agricultura Familiar, the Federation of Family Agriculture. But similar dwellings, you can see. And this is taken from a documentary on the expansion of sugarcane production for agribusiness, for biofuels particularly. I did not do this documentary. This was done by someone else, but this is a clip of the documentary, and it shows you what's called a despejo, right, of a protest occupation. And a despejo means basically clearance, a clearing out. And they are announced in advance by the state. The police come, they say, well, this date we're going to come and you have to leave according to a court order. And so the leadership of the squatter camp will try to organize a response, and we'll try to get other leaders of other groups, including people from the reservation, to come and to do a demonstration. It's a type of political theater to counter their removal. And you'll see some of these images here. Oh, sorry. Of course, there's always a few glitches with a presentation, at least with me. I'm not going to generalize, sorry.
A invasão da monocultura de cana-de-açúcar na região colide com os direitos das populações indígenas sobre suas terras. Muitas comunidades estão sendo expulsas de seus territórios, mesmo que estes já tenham sido reconhecidos pelo Estado.
Se acaso não puderem sair, aí nós vamos voltar aqui para tirar as pessoas para vocês entrarem. Mas isso tem que esperar a justiça. Infelizmente é assim.
Nós somos gente, nós somos humanos que apenas querem sobreviver.
Nós vai ter que ser livres. Sempre somos livres e nunca pode ser assim, executados. Muitos nessa liderança morreram, choraram com nós. Todos choraram por todos nossos netos.
So you see, sometimes oftentimes the squatter protesters will squat inside the plantation. And this is always more dangerous because you're interfering with the operation of the plantation. And in these cases, you saw in the despejo, or in the either official despejo by the state or by the plantation owner security forces, they might come in, burn down the occupations. And there's all sorts of stories of violence, various forms of violence, and like I described, beatings, killings of protesters by these third-party security forces. But that threat of entering the plantation, actually disrupting and occupying inside the plantation, is always sort of escalates the confrontation and violence. And the people I work with would always tell me, when you come back, next time you come back, you're going to be on the other side of this fence. And there's always that threat of escalation on both sides, although the violence obviously is extraordinarily uneven and asymmetrical. The violence of entering a plantation versus the violence of being forced off a plantation is obviously extraordinarily asymmetrical. Okay, so today I'm analyzing the emergence of these protest camps with rural economic development. As Bernard mentioned, specifically the mass displacement of rural inhabitants, the influx of international finance capital, the casualization of labor, and the reorganization of politics, particularly ethno-racial politics, in the last half century. While state and development agencies discursively produce the countryside as empty and available for ever more capital-intensive forms of agriculture, this model relies on transient floating laborers who reside in urban peripheries and indigenous reservations. Indeed, the camps, the squatter camps, arise out of the transient nature of settlement prefigured in urban slums and the slum-like conditions on reservations. Such slums are features of urbanization that have been the hallmark of development in Brazil. The category of squatter camp and its basis of transience exists in ironic juxtaposition to the supposed permanence of urban marginality and the reimagining of rural space. The protesters sustain their lives in the camps through a combination of government welfare programs and remunerated work, mainly for agro-industrial firms. I focus on the role of labor in the day-to-day life of the camps, as well as in the history of the mobilizations. Government-issued work documents are significant to this analysis in that they function to attach rural laborers to larger networks of production and exchange. I argue that government work and identification documents act as racial tethers that operate to essentially refix these workers to land, an ironic contradistinction to the floating, casualized nature of their employment with agro-industrial firms. I'm interested in the antipathy to land redistribution in Brazil and the larger society, and the ways that what I'm calling racial tethers are both seen and unseen in this society. The role of race and racial ideology in Brazil is difficult to understate. In Brazil, there is a hyper-consciousness of race, as anthropologist João Costa Vargas puts it. Brazil's version of racial ideology famously operates through colorism, which presents what has been called racial malleability or ambiguity, in which no one is completely monoracial, supposedly. As João Costa Vargas points out, such colorism logically presupposes a racial binary of black-white. I would add that there also exists an overlapping binary of white indigenous versus indigenous. Vargas writes, quote, "There would be no color multiplicity if it were not for the awareness of the polarities of the races that generated them." Indeed, the common saying that paso de branco preto é, literally meaning if you're beyond white or if you can't pass as white, then you're black, reveals that underlying the color spectrum is a clear understanding of a white, non-white binary system that determines social privileges based on race, end quote. One aspires to move away from identification with blackness or with indigeneity through phenotypic characteristics or ways of acting that approximate whiteness, reinforcing notions of white supremacy. The construction and workings of these binaries vary regionally, but consistently mark bodies and space across Brazil. As an African-American researcher, marked currently as negra, preta, black woman, in Dourados, I regularly heard ethnic and racial discourses marking the city as white. I received such characterizations of the town completely unsolicited, at moments in which no one had mentioned race. For example, over lunch with Douradenses, one commented to me that Dourados had a lot of Indians and asked if I'd ever seen so many. Dourados is full of poeira, red dust, mosquitos, and Indians, people would say. One day, a man lamented that Dourados had so many Indians. São Paulo does not have this problem, he said. I pointed out to him that, in fact, there's a large Guarani reservation within the city limits of the city of São Paulo. He shrugged this off, insisting that Dourados had to deal with a lot more. He then asked me if my home region in the United States had, quote, a lot of Indians like Dourados. Such remarks are not out of place in Mato Grosso do Sul, which has the second largest indigenous population of any state in Brazil. There are common, unabashed expressions of fantasies of genocide. For example, on a different occasion, a Douradense bristled at my condemnation of the violence directed at indigenous land protesters. The Douradense interlocutor stated point blank that, quote, the United States killed all of its Indians, but does not want Brazil to kill its own, end quote. Thus, they complained of the perceived injustice of American hypocrisy. An archaeologist at the Federal University of Greater Dourados published an article in a local newspaper in which he laments that, quote, in Mato Grosso do Sul, one frequently observes people saying that we should do what was done in the United States with indigenous people from there. Total annihilation, end quote. He counters that such extermination did not take place in the United States and that there are still vibrant indigenous communities through the continental US, Alaska, and Hawaii, although, quote, everything is not roses for them, end quote. The minimal attempt to encourage education and recognition of historical struggle and survival as a counter to open musings on the annihilation of indigenes puts into perspective the gravity of anti-indigenous sentiment in Mato Grosso do Sul and the commitment to an understanding of the region as branco, white. The ethno-racial boundaries etched into understandings of space concur with those marking bodies in the region, though in contorted ways complicated by the aforementioned racial ideology of mixture and miscegenation that remains prevalent in the construction of Brazilian national identity, in which there supposedly prevails a racial harmony, an absence of racism lent by a history of race mixture. As a result, many Brazilians most often disavow racism with shorthands like, aqui ninguém é branco, here no one is white, or we are all mixed. In other words, how can there be racism when everyone's mixed, given Brazil's history and their own Brazilianness? Nevertheless, in official state policy, acculturation has given way to a version of liberal multiculturalism in the 1988 Constitution that followed the end of the 20-year dictatorship, military dictatorship in Brazil. In the Constitution, Indians are no longer considered to be moving away from Indianness towards whiteness, enacted through the supposed stripping away of Indian culture. State agencies, federal, state, and municipal, enact policies aimed at inclusion and redress of prior displacements of Indian people through designations of exceptional spaces, i.e. reservations, which are state-owned and administered. However, I would argue that such recognition does not and cannot fully extend to landed property due to the imperatives of capital accumulation and national progress, which are necessarily white, though unmarked as such. And ethnic land titling and demarcation provide exceptions to the rule of the logic of landholding, where even those pushing for exceptional space in the form of state recognition of indigenous reservations and quilombos, which are designated spaces for descendants of escaped African slaves, land claims which face a hostile and often violent opposition. What is transpiring in Mato Grosso do Sul, a context of intense land grabbing and agribusiness development, is an instance of this larger history and context for regimes of racial ideology which find their most exemplary expression in land. The context of an imagined exclusively white space that is only not yet fully white give particular contours to Mato Grosso do Sul as a place of colonial turned national frontier. The exceptional space, the Afro-descendant Quilombo, or the Indian reservation, is exceptional to national development and are seen as an egregious affront and offense in popular sentiment. Government documents play a critical role in the mediation of workers' access to the means of subsistence, to both remunerated labor and state food and healthcare welfare programs. They are practical elements of their means of survival, as the protesters discuss it. State agencies sometimes act as facilitators of access to welfare and as advocates for land reform. At the same time, there is often a remarkable lack of state intervention. Silences and seeming procrastination encountering high degrees of exploitation and marginalization of the poorest of indigenous rural workers. In this way, they go unseen. Indeed, the very government documents that support the protest squatters' subsistence at the same time may facilitate their subjugation to local strongmen and agro-industrial firms. These circumstances, I argue, are part of the impetus and logic of the protest camp mobilizations. Given the critical role played by government-issued work and identification documents, it's not surprising to see current efforts by the state to confer more documents, more widely, to indigenous people. The federal and state governments in Mato Grosso do Sul have instituted initiatives to provide identification documents to currently undocumented indigenous people. For example, in June 2011, the government distributed civil and indigenous documents to more than 11,000 indigenous people in the Bororo and Jaguapiru reservations on the outskirts of Dourados. Nearly 6,700 of them, indigenous people, received birth certificates for the first time. Previously, the majority of indigenous Brazilians, roughly 90%, had possessed only a card for the National Administrative Registration of Indians, the Registro Administrativo Nacional do Indio, or the RANI, which is an indigenous identity card issued by FUNAI, but that's not accepted or really recognized outside of reservations. We should note that such programs to expand document identification, documents, birth certificates, work permits, etc., are taking place elsewhere around the globe. Note the example of India. where software billionaire Nandan Nilekani financed a public scheme known as Aadhaar. He created a national biometric database 10 times larger than the world's next largest biometric database that aims to help reduce the gap and inequality that occurred with and despite India's economic growth of recent decades. The effort has been called, quote, the biggest social project on the planet. In Mato Grosso do Sul, the identification document events take place as part of the Programa Cidadania, Derecho de Todos, Citizenship, Everyone's Right program of the Conselho Nacional de Justiça, the National Justice Council, and in partnership with another program that has an acronym of nearly a dozen letters. Of course, those familiar with Brazilian bureaucracy would not be shocked by such a long acronym. The Portuguese version is the Comitê Estadual para a Erradicação do Subregistro Civil de Nascimento e Ampliação ao Acesso à Documentação Básica, which roughly translates as the State Committee for Broad Access to Basic Documents and the Elimination of the Under-Registration of Birth Certificates, called the CEESRAD-MS. The program offers civil documents like a birth certificate, identity card, and a document required for commercial and financial transactions, the CPF. The government has also launched public awareness campaigns to draw television and newspaper coverage of the registration drives. Typical coverage shows photographs and video of lines of indigenous people at tables signing up for their documents, and contractors from notarial agencies explaining to indigenous people the details and importance of government documents for national registration. According to the Conselho Nacional de Justiça, the program aims to grant thousands of Brazilian citizens access to fundamental rights like health, education, and inclusion in the labor market. In 2011, Daniela Isler, the project coordinator for the program, publicly announced, quote, these documents will permit the indigenous people to study and work and enable them to receive benefits like family welfare, pensions, social security. Without these indispensable documents, the Indians who live in urban regions are pushed into the informal labor market. Both the birth certificate and the work card will register their ethnicity and the name of their village, a form of preserving indigenous tradition, end quote. Yet this proclamation contrasts with the ethnographic account introduced at the start of my talk today, to which I will return now. I arranged transport to reunite Diego with his work documents. Among the documents that he had somehow left behind were his carteira de trabalho and his registro nacional. He said that it was impossible for him to work for any of the firmas, the agro-industrial firms in the region, without those documents. He had previously lived on the reservation in Amambai, where he had worked for an usina, an ethanol distillery, cutting sugarcane. I was already planning a trip to Amambai. A professor friend at the Amambai campus of the State University had asked me to come give a guest lecture. So, as quite a few professors at the Amambai campus commute there from Dourados, I arranged for Diego and I to ride with a carpool. I was under the impression that recovering the documents would be relatively straightforward. However, the morning of our trip, shortly after picking him up from the camp, it was clear that it would not be so simple. Diego explained that a man who owned a supermarket refused to return the documents to him. So he thought it best that I pretend to be his American lawyer when we arrived. He explained that if the market owner thought that I was Diego's lawyer from the United States, then he would be intimidated into returning the documents. This surprised me, obviously. He had not previously indicated any reason why such a ruse should be useful. However, by this point, it was more than clear that his relationship to this merchant was not above board. It worried me that he was asking me to play the role of intimidator, with only my gringo accent to protect me. Also, it was worrying to be put in a position of vulnerability to a person who minimally holds others' documents against their wishes, and at worst, does who knows what. It's worth noting here the imaginary invoked in Diego's request. Clearly, he was attempting a sort of scaling up in negotiations of power, essentially attempting to leapfrog local bosses by linking his demands to the assortment of international actors that entered the region in recent decades. We also note that Diego did not go to the police or to FUNAI, the federal agency in charge of indigenous affairs, to solve his problem. Nor did he ask that I pretend to be an American journalist, for example. The conflicts over land are transpiring both on the roadside and the spectacle of the squatter camp, and the sometimes violent confrontations with plantation owners, but also happen parallel in juridical battles and court proceedings sorting through land disputes. So asking for a lawyer in this case, an American one at that, is not merely a coincidence. It points to what Komarov and others have called the emergence of lawfare under neoliberalism. That is, the proliferation of lawsuits and legal wrangling as a means of sorting that which was previously pursued in the arena of politics. The formerly political has been relegated to the realm of law and legal qualms. We may read Diego's reach for the figure of the lawyer as an instantiation of such a shift. To return to the vignette, the merchant store was small, 4 or 5 shallow aisles of convenience grocery stores, commodities. Despite being located relatively far from the Amambai reservation, most of the clientele were indigenous. The store owner was a white Brazilian. He had several colleagues who looked on attentively, some of them keeping a slight distance, lingering. One of these associates, though, was aggressive, seemingly in a drug-induced hyper-intensity as he approached me and the other professors. He drifted over, arriving uncomfortably close to my face, staring into my eyes. The whole exchange seemed surreal, and its very strange mix of people and odd behaviors. The merchant told Diego that he did not have his work documents, that they were with a third person. This person was an indigenous gato, cat in Portuguese, a colloquial term for a third-party contractor of manual laborers, who had facilitated Diego's connection to the store owner and to the sugarcane plantation / ethanol fuel distillery where he worked. Gatos are called such because of the cat's characteristics of being stealth, slick, and quick. The gato holds the workers' documents while they labor for agro-industrial firms. He then distributes the workers' pay and mediates their relationship to local merchants. The worker shops at the merchant stores exclusively, their purchases deducted from their salary and state food allowances and welfare benefits. At that point, the merchant proceeded to out how and why Diego had really lost the documents, accusing Diego of stealing from the store. He said that he had it all on videotape. Diego owed him money, he said. The gato would also repeat the accusation of being owed money when we confronted him on the Amambai reservation later. The reservation is located just outside the city, similar to the city reservation spatial arrangement in Dourados. Diego's ordeal began when he was living on the Amambai reservation before moving to the protest squatter camp. One day, the gato showed up at his house asking if he wanted to work. The relationship ended with Diego owing hundreds of reais, Brazil's currency, and being accused of stealing from the company merchant and having his work documents held for ransom. These types of relationships are the norm on reservations. In their role as mediators with firms, plantations, gatos maintain power. They enforce their authority over the workers by withholding their documents, requiring them to continue to work for them. Not having his documents in his possession and control prohibits the worker from simply moving on to work for a different gato in a different firm or shop at different stores. In essence, control of the documents fixes the worker to a specific network of gato, firm, merchant, and a specific mode of extraction and exploitation. The relationship is premised on the worker's labor and accumulated debt. The debt accumulates structurally, as the goods available in the store are sold at prices above market rate. The worker's consumption, therefore, exceeds his salaries and benefits. Should I pause?
I think you can just continue.
Huh?
We hear you.
Okay. All right. Where this occurs, he is tethered to a gato firm merchant network by debt, not contractual remuneration. From the store, we went to the local office of FUNAI, the federal agency overseeing Indian affairs, a much smaller building than FUNAI's Dourados office. A feeling of futility permeated the whole encounter. We wanted to inform FUNAI of the situation and to seek their input. After all, the reservation is their jurisdiction. The representative from FUNAI, a low-level functionary, said that he could not assist at that moment for lack of available agency vehicles. He then proceeded to take down a report on the back of a random used scrap piece of paper on his desk, writing in ballpoint ink. He said that someone would follow up with the issue in the coming weeks, which no one did. He said, so he said all this, but it was curious to me how anyone could follow up since the functionary did not write down a telephone number or any contact information for Diego. Years later, while perusing a newspaper archive, I discovered that that particular FUNAI office had not existed without controversy, as recently as a few years before my visit there. On October 6, 2005, an article in the Correio do Estado, a newspaper in the state capital of Campo Grande, reported a protest staged by Guarani people outside of that very Amambai FUNAI office. The article described how Guarani overtook the building on September 22nd of that year, demanding the firing of the then regional administrator of Funai, William Rodriguez. The protesters were demanding that the president of the Association of Indigenous Kiowa Guarani, Captains of Mato Grosso do Sul, Dilson Duarte Hikelme, be named as the new regional administrator. They accused the sitting Funai administrator of trafficking in drugs, firearms, and alcohol on the reservations of Amambai. Fast forwarding back to the day of our quest to recover Diego's documents, we are left to wonder where the state was in all of this. Presumably, Diego, the professors, and I were trying to rectify a violation of the law, of Diego's rights. I was told repeatedly, including by various members of state agencies, that Diego's problem was a common occurrence. Where were the police or Funai in assuming these responsibilities? And that they described Diego's predicament as commonplace, I wondered how had this become an open norm for workers in which even the state and labor unions did not intervene. The series of manipulations of Diego that I've described, though commonplace, seem to take place almost behind the back of the aims of document distribution programs, though in plain sight of inhabitants of the region. I recall a visit to my neighborhood grocery store shortly after arriving in Dorados for fieldwork in 2011. In the middle of the city, a small truck sat parked in front of a supermarket. In the store, a white man stood by a checkout counter with a clipboard tracking the purchases of a line of indigenous people who were checking out. They filed into a truck after making their purchases. The store was running a similar operation to that encountered at the market in Amambai with Diego. These illegal dealings take place in plain daylight. The Gato merchant agribusiness firm network of indigenous exploitation in Dorados is not restricted to the reservation itself or to a single neighborhood in a given city. The relations between capital, land, and labor in Brazil rely on a generation of surplus value through the perpetual rendering of racial markings and bindings on indigenous bodies that are somehow both seen and overseen, unseen, and overseen. These racial markers are both explicit and obfuscated, at least in part by processes of state mediation. State ID, identification documents, and work permits, such as the ones that Diego was desperate to recover, are examples of such mediation. Such mediation operates as forms of what I'm calling racial tethers for indigenous people who are, through these mediated processes, racially subjugated in the political economy of agribusiness. To say that racialized subjects are overseen refers to how neo-colonial forms of racial subjugation in this part of the world are so brazen and mundane so as to garner little attention as anything outside of the norm. I invite you to consider how A, unseen bondage and captivity, and B, surveillance in a condition of being overseen are necessary central motifs to the workings of capital. Famously, part of the dynamism of capital is how it operates through older forms of hierarchies, uniquely and differently insinuated within and across locales. This dynamic of racialized subjects being overseen and unseen is curious. It is a dialectic essential to unpacking the perceptions of what is occurring in the social processes that I've described over the course of this talk. How are these relations of capital, land, and labor both seen and not seen? In this case, understanding is not lent by the senses of what one sees with one's eyes, nor is it purely imbued by reason through a cognitive faculty of appraising, that is, a rational capacity to reason beyond the vagaries of the particulars lent by the senses in a given instance. Instead of this Kantian distinction between the appearances of things, phenomena, and noumena, things in themselves, which you can never fully get at according to Kant, Hegel and later Marx insisted that the faculty of appraising/understanding must yet account for how it itself comes into being. Thus, the recourse to dialectics. What C.L.R. James calls the dialectical relation of substance, objective reality, and subject, mind, come together not as givens, but as processes of a perpetual coming to be, becoming, ever shifting and moving as moments that are ceaselessly in the process of accounting for themselves, making each other and themselves in time. These processes in perpetual construction at each moment must in turn account for their production through a history that is not past, not just a prior moment, but one inextricably bound up in a determination of being that is unfinished, that both has and has not yet occurred, and whose determinateness is a past that is also yet to come. But how does this make sense given the particularities not just of a given historical convergence, a historically produced moment, but how do we account for both a given production of event and how the mind perceives them? What of the dialectic of the unseen and overseen that is the workings of race and capital? What do we make of racial ideologies which are also national ideologies, that are the tapestry of such moments such as those that I am describing in this paper, and which are unfolding in the making of agribusiness production in this part of Brazil? Diego's dilemma, the land conflict between indigenous subjects like Diego, and the multiple international scales of finance capital undergirding agribusiness, mediated by the state, bring into concrete confrontation the admittedly abstract dialectics that I've been exploring regarding understanding, knowing, i.e. epistemology, and racialized being, i.e. ontology, that is to be rendered invisible and yet hyper-surveilled, overseen. Here, I am engaged in a deliberate play on words between seeing, perceiving, and the connotative references to the overseen and the overseers that are essential to conditions of slavery. The conditions of being overseen and the role of the overseer in the context of Brazilian plantation economies conjures a strange feeling of deja vu. After all, there is something familiar about racialized enslaved labor, particularly coerced indigenous labor. But how does this past that is not past come to be in this moment? The same but different. The state actors involved in programs like the CEESRAD-MS, seemingly well-meaning, are both aware that the abuses are taking place, yet convinced that doubling down on document dispersal will facilitate the realization of the protections of the law. It is a strange myopia, an almost irrational optimism through which the structures of labor exploitation continue unabated. And yet, the model of agribusiness expansion and land politics that I've described today are an essential part of the agricultural boom of recent decades and relies on the facilitation of access to cheap labor and readily available agrarian real estate, which underlie Diego's circumstances. Such structural conditions offer scant hope of the type of heroic enforcement of rights and justice promised by state documents. And the abstractions of land and labor as configured in agribusiness, the Foucaultian notion of jails without walls, where there is structure without or regardless of agency, provides a useful consideration for the problem Diego faces as it transpires. The racial tethers that I point out, as they occur in the form of bureaucratic documents, binds people to confined courses of mobility. They circulate, but only within certain prefigured circuits. They are free to go as they please and choose, but only insofar as the pre-existing networks of intermediaries extend. This play of forces occurs both in interdiction of the law and in plain sight of the law's authors, the liberal democratic people, or communitas, and its executors, the government, law enforcement. And yet, they do not or cannot see it as a repetition of history. This state of being is thoroughly racialized, repeats long-standing historical modes of racialized exploitation, neo-colonial reworkings of prior settler colonial hierarchies of racialization. In summary, Diego has lived without roots. Diego's life has been marked by a decided lack of fixity, transience, wandering to more than a few locations to live and work. Historia is quite common amongst the mão de obra, the manual laborers in the region. Floating labor, trabalhadores volantes, have been a fixture in Brazil with the mass displacement of rural laborers in the last century. Diego's participation in the protest camp is to lay claim to a particular parcel of land, to fix himself to a parcel of land as a purported ethnic ancestral rootedness. In so doing, he is attempting to fix himself to a certain conception of place, one prefigured by indigenous land law, but for the first time in his life. Diego's relative lack of fixity as a displaced rural inhabitant turned rural worker is part of a commonplace ethnicized, racialized, and class-informed condition of lack of fixity. One could also view the government documents which grant access to work and welfare benefits, and thus a means of survival, as ironically offering a fixity in their function of formalizing ties to the state and to agro-business labor, their value heightened by the circumstances of transience and the lack of fixity to other means of survival and other means of self-sufficiency, for example, to land. The documents tie these workers to sub-networks of intermediaries and firms. The state is the ultimate overseer of these terms, in that it imposes, requires, and legitimates work documents. Not that the state is comprehensible in any straightforward way, mind you. The state in Brazil is often at odds with itself on the issue of land reform and agricultural production. FUNAI, FUNASA, the Ministry, the Health Agency of Indigenous Affairs, FUNASA, the Ministerio Público Federal, the Federal Attorney General, that is, they've all often been supporters of the agrarian movement, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, in the face of overwhelming public antipathy. Where other parts of the state, by contrast, like the Ministry of Agriculture, publicly support the agribusiness syndicates, the agribusiness complex interests, that their plights. The government of the Labor Party, the Partido Trabalhista, the PT, in power from the inauguration of Luis Ignacio de Silva Lula in 2003 until the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016, began as sympathetic to those favoring agrarian reform. However, Lula and later Dilma had a splintered task and were committed both to land reform and to the encouragement of agribusiness expansion. The latter provided a boon to external revenues that had been key for financing both the expansion of the welfare state under the PT and to the construction of infrastructure and stadiums for global sports spectacles, like the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. They required the expanding state external revenues provided by agribusiness. Not to mention that the PT had settled on an alliance, a governing alliance in Congress with the ruralist bloc, which they put firmly inside the government, whatever the otherwise divergent interests within the party. Finally, I found it impossible to decipher on the ground where the state began and ended. The kin networks of local city councilmen, judges, and other public officials overlaps and intersects with local businessmen and with agribusiness interests. For example, the governor of Mato Grosso do Sul was both a doctor and a plantation owner. However, this intermediate system of local bosses and strongmen that I described operated seemingly out of the view of the state, without its sanction, and indeed an interdiction of its laws. But there are neither villains nor heroes in this story. Gatos may be well respected or held in contempt as much as any businessman or politician. We may best figure the Gato merchant agribusiness network's relations to the state as neither inside nor outside of the state. Rather, the state and the middlemen are mere nodes of mediation of a larger structure of production, capitalist production that has historically unfolded. And it is here that I would like to conclude by briefly touching on some practical implications of this ethnographic analysis. There is much to be gained by favoring land reform, by favoring land redistribution. We should focus on property like land, as opposed to programs that confer labor and other rights via identification documents, and thereby resisting some of the more fetishistic qualities of the law. It is difficult to maintain that a more robust fulfillment of labor rights would alleviate the myriad problems brought to bear in the ethnographic analysis that I've rendered in this talk. Instead, land demarcation, land redistribution, and a larger shift to focus on small landholders may hold more promise in this regard. Consider the Agro Ecology movement in Brazil, led by those sympathetic to land reform like the previously mentioned MST. They challenged the sustainability of a prevailing agricultural model introduced for and through agribusiness. They call for utilizing select native plants and mixed crops as opposed to pesticides, herbicides, and monocrop production. This counter movement is in part a response to the crises in the availability of foreign reserves, which I've already mentioned, for financing of which are necessary for financing of pesticides, GMO seeds, and agribusiness products and production techniques, which triggered the food crises in much of the global south in the 1990s and 2000s. Moreover, production from smallholders have the benefit of maintaining wealth across more producers who are more locally based and more widely dispersed, which has additional multiplier effects. Such an outcome offsets the need for welfare programs, which serve to effectively subsidize large-scale agro-industrial firms by helping to sustain their labor force. This is not completely misaligned from some of what has previously taken place in Brazil under the PT. Former President Dilma Rousseff's speech during a visit to a dairy cooperative of MST in Paraná in February 2013 is an example. Dilma proclaimed, quote, "We want to create a bigger middle class in the countryside, a middle class of small producers, a middle class of cooperatives." It is important that in this gesture, however, that the state directed 115 billion reais to large producers in its 2012-2013 agricultural plan, and only 18 billion reais to small producers. In closing, Diego's rather transient participation in land protests, that is to say when he's not working to sustain his life, is a rebuke to the system of material dependence on these documents. His demand for land is an attempt to insist on an alternative fixedness as a means to gain greater traction and control over his means of survival. Such is the alternative fixedness that he perceives land to offer. We can also view his participation in land struggle as a rebuke to his condition of being overseen, and yet always unseen, an attempt to slip the tethers of bondage that go with this condition. Thank you.
And is the thing on? Is it working? Great. Okay. So as we normally do here, as is our tradition, we take a round of questions. It might be helpful for you to write them down. So
Okay.
I'm opening the floor now to a couple of questions. And please, Eli, I see Eli's hand. I'm looking for more.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. That's marvelous.
Thanks.
I still have to think a bit about kind of the Hegelian and dialectical moment of it, I think. But I just wanted to ask kind of a question about gender and casualization kind of to start out. I started thinking about gender kind of towards the end of your talk, actually, when suddenly the word middleman, like the man and middleman, kind of started to resonate in my head a bit. And it started to occur to me that many of the actors you described are men, right? I mean, I didn't count, but it seems like most of them are men. Which seems to say something about kind of the masculinity or masculinization kind of a casualized labor system. And I guess, I guess I have two questions. One is, and they're not hostile questions, they're just kind of requests for further knowledge, I guess. What's the relationship kind of between gender dynamics and the labor processes that you're describing? And then I wonder if you have any comments on one of the things that comes up a lot in kind of discussions of casualization in the global north, like in France where I work on, is that casualization is a process of feminization, which doesn't seem to fit your case at all in terms of the data that you gave us. And I wonder if in some sense your case is an instance of, in fact, this kind of connection between casualization and feminization being a quite historically particular process, which one just doesn't find everywhere, that there's kind of casualized workforce. Maybe that's enough of the question to start out.
Okay, others? Cheryl?
So thank you. There's so much to engage with, and also to, I suppose, think about in relation to some of the debates and struggles here. So just on that, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about the sort of the bondage to the mediators and the lot of documents and who has them, who possesses them. There's similar dynamics around our social grant system and the payment of the cards and who owns the cards, which are not, they're not around agricultural labor necessarily. So there's just some interesting similarities, I think, and dynamics to think about there. But I was intrigued at the end by the land claim, and you could just unpack a little bit more about what Diego, not what he's claiming so much, but what the land would be used for. Because you talked about, and also how it would be the underlying notions of ownership, perhaps, around that. I mean, at the moment we're having a debate about state ownership or dispossessed ownership or sort of mixed models in this country. And it's what would be who would be the underlying owner in that process? Is it a collective? Is it the state? Is it, well, what would it be? And how is that land to be demarcated? And what would the role of documents, including IDs, marriage certificates, maybe piggybacking on the gender question or whatever, be in relation to tying people to the parcel of land?
Paula? No, it's not a question. Okay. Do you want to, there's 3 questions in that, so at least.
Yeah.
So you want to go ahead and I'm looking for more hands for a second round.
Okay. Okay. Great questions. I feel properly intimidated in answering them, but I'll give it my best. So I'll start with the latter questions and then double back to the first questions. So I'll start with the question. Well, what would the land be used for? Should the land claimants be successful and get land demarcated? And that question is kind of at the crux of the dilemma of whether to demarcate it, right? So the question of who owns the land and then what is it going to be used for, and the sort of stakes of that. And the question of, well, what would be, how consequential would it be? If, for example, part of the condition of displacement and landlessness that is a racialized condition in this case is that Indians don't produce anything. And that's what I've heard that recurrently. Indians don't produce anything. So so much land, so few Indians, right? And that's this type of of dialogue, and it's hard to separate the prospects for thinking about, well, what come from demarcation and the characterizations of the questions as they underlie or undergird the conditions of landlessness or dispossession that these people are in. The way that folks that I've worked with talk about, well, what would they do once they get land, is there's a lot of different kind of imaginaries that are brought forth or put into effect, including the idea that they would use it to go back to prior ways of life. That's oftentimes as a part of the rhetoric of claiming the land. It's the one that's required by Indigenous land law, right? So the land is Indigenous lands, which are owned by what's called the Union. They're federally owned and administered. It's not considered a private land title, and unlike some conditions of Indigenous land titling in the U.S., for example, there's not some sort of condition of sovereignty or some sort of separate political entity. It's owned by the federal state, it's administered by the federal state for the so-called protection of the Indians, and the land is demarcated as such for Indigenous people explicitly in order for Indigenous people to be able to reproduce their culture. And so the ways of talking by the land claimants about what they would do with the land or what's to come of the land, they deliberately invoked a kind of imaginary of horticultural activities and so on and so forth, because that's actually required for the land demarcation. Right? That's the justification for the protection of this folkloric Indigenous culture. And so that's part of what you get in the rhetoric. But, there's also, talking informally to folks, I hear people say, well, I say, well, what are you going to do if your mother, like some of the leaders are women, kind of touching on the gender question, and the Indigenous protesters and leadership are women. And in political meetings, for example, there was called Atiguasu, which are grand reunions, big meetings. There have been Atiguasu, or big meetings of just female women, where I need, or women Indigenous leaders, in order to address the sort of very gendered differences in how politics occurs, how social organization occurs, which is a very complicated question, and I'm going to double back to it, but it's a lot. But I remember a conversation I had with one of the protesters. He said, well, if his mom was one of the leaders, gets the land, he still plans on living in the city where he where he had been displaced onto, because he had a great job for Agrarian, which was to build swimming pools in the area. And so he would, his is on the land, but he was going to continue to live in the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, there are different sort of levels. On the one hand, there's sort of rhetoric around a kind of folkloric indigenous land use practices, horticultural activities and the like, and that's the imagined use of the land. But there's also have been programs and still ongoing programs to buy tractors and to have these kind of agricultural development to be self-sustaining for indigenous people that are in the mix as well, that are already happening on some indigenous reservations. There's also a lot controversially cases where on indigenous reservations you have some families who will lease out some of their land for agribusiness production. So you have fazendas or plantations in some of the reservations that are sugarcane and the like that are leased. So there's a lot of complex existing practices, imagined practices that are part of this question of, well, what's going to come from the land and what are the terms for its demarcation, et cetera. Hopefully that spelled out a little bit in answer to that question. When you ask how the land would be demarcated, are you asking the actual processes, state processes for designating the land?
I suppose I was interested in the role of the documents, the ID documents or whatever, as part of that process around demarcation.
Yeah, so the state mediation via documents would continue. The same, it's a part of the reservation process already, right? So it would be if a land claim were to be, it would be studied. You'd have a study that would be commissioned by FUNAI and by the state. There would be a group of anthropologists convened to do a study that would then be submitted to FUNAI, and then there would be a ruling by a judge on the merits of the case. And those people would be granted, it would be then the designation of the land that they are claiming would be made, and the landowner would be remunerated. So you have what's called market-led land reform in Brazil. So you have to compensate the plantation owners for any land that gets demarcated as indigenous land. And so there's all sorts of bureaucratic processes to budget, and anytime you're talking about money, and there's going to be many lags and many complications. But that's typically the process. And the people who occupy that land are documented in the study for the demarcation, right? They have to show that they have been previously removed to the land, or they have some sort of cultural ties to the land, which may involve cosmological implications, et cetera, regarding their way of life, et cetera. But those people designated in the study, it would be the ones who would have the documented ties to the land, who would be able to occupy that land as administered by the state, right, through the state. That's hopefully that gives you a little sense of the ongoing role of the documents. Exactly, the state as protector of indigenous people, and that idea of is specific in Brazil. It's different than in other areas in South America, where somehow the state is a necessary protector of the indigenous people and holds the land and administers it with them and for them. And every reservation is a different story. There's a tremendous diversity, even within Mato Grosso do Sul, but especially across, like, for example, I mentioned the Kayapo, known as, who have a reputation for being sort of fierce warriors, and they deliberately cultivate and maintain that reputation of murdering. There's a lot of gold mining in some in Kayapo territory. There were famous cases of them murdering miners, to enforce. They are a part of the enforcement of their reservation, the administration of their reservation, have a very tenuous relationship with the state, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of diversity and difference across groups, and even within the same reservation, between groups and families and reservations. In the reservation in Dourados, you have different ethnic groups. You have Guarani, you have Torena, and there's a complicated political history of sort of the use and misuse and abuse of ethnicity and ethnic, so-called ethnic groupings to administer the reservation between the Terena and the Guarani. So it's very sort of complicated how these mediations occur, and how ethnic demarcation as indigenous, and then within that, different ethnic indigenous groups are being mediated by the state, that sort of diverge across different places. So it's hopefully not convoluted, but it's a very complex question and complex answer, and that's just a little bit of how I would address that. Does that get at most of what you were asking? Yeah, there's very excellent questions. The gender question and casualization as a process of feminization is excellent as well, and it definitely brings to mind the need for, in talking about casualization of labor as a process of feminization of labor, to be more specific about what we mean with that. Because certainly, I think that part of that assertion is applicable in the Brazilian context. Typically what's meant by that, maybe I'm wrong, but oftentimes we're talking about like mechanization, post-industrialization, those types of shifts. And you have, whereas, with agribusiness production, it's much, I know I'm going to regret this as soon as I say it, but cause I think it's way too overly schematized, but I'm tempted to say, and I will retract it before I even say it, to get that what you had is a process of industrialization. Maybe we're talking about a different kind of moment of casualization that's being overlaid into a capitalization of production, right? Where with sugarcane production, with cane cutting, it was a shift to the expansion of sugarcane production, particularly since the 40s, was an agro-industrialization of sugarcane production, right? And so the type of casualized labor, the displacement off of rural inhabitants onto urban peripheries, and then this kind of through buses and the like, the sort of transiting of these day laborers in and out of urban peripheries and reservations to the countryside and then back to the city to live, the rendering void of rural spaces living, sites of dwelling, that is always an industrialization process. That was a casualization process. And and maybe in other contexts, the industrialization process is not a casualization process. Industrialization is the implementation of a form of social life or social relations that were kind of the masculinization and the kind of patriarchal family, where the family is a site of the industrial worker, and so on and so forth. And so that would be, perhaps one of the differences. But certainly, cane cutting and soy and agricultural work is extremely mechanized now. Even since I started working in 2007, this area, there's a tremendous amount of mechanization and people, not having jobs, right? Unemployment is a big issue now. So it's, worse than the casualized conditions of casualized labor. Floating labor is floating unemployed grinding, right? So floating unemployed former rural people. So that's a big part of it. And so you have, I would have to think more about how what types of work or lack of types of unemployment are replacing, or not replacing, but are kind of intertwining with and are part of this casualization, which probably was the case even amidst the agro-industrialization, right? Even amidst the casualization, you had types of not working, right? The floating, kind of transience is a condition of both working and not. There's a precariousness to it as well that's essential to that experience. And I think you would necessarily have to talk about that being the feminization being intertwined with that. I think how to go farther with that, I'm not sure. but let me keep thinking about it.
I wasn't alleging that there was a lack in the talk. The talk was a plenitude of things.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but no, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, it makes me think about how, in talking about casualization, I should think about casualized work as being also a kind of casualized unemployment. Like, it's strange to say, right? This, like, being made to be transient and precarious and floating is being made to deal with how one's inability to work under the conditions that one can determine oneself, or that one has more control over. Yeah. And that is a type of unemployment as much as it is a condition of labor. It's a condition of not being, right, having labor or being labor. And how that might be, am I going on too far?
No.
But how that might be a kind of the role of gender in that, or one's experience of gender in that, is an important thing to consider. Like how in this case casualization might be feminization as well. Even though I've talked primarily about male laborers. The reason that I'm talking about male cane cutters is because there were at different moments women cane cutting in this area, but because you have to go away from home, and because a lot of times the rooming, the lodging, the temporary lodging at these sites, depending on how far you have to travel away from the reservation, there were all sorts of security concerns, and that are also quite gendered around rape and so on and so forth. But I also work with women who Guarani and other ethnic groups of women who also participated in this kind of casualized labor condition. Although I did talk most about men, it is mostly men for some of the reasons that I pointed out. But there are women as well. I don't want to leave that out.
So another round of questions. I see Ivana's hand. I'm looking for others. I have a question too. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very rich presentation. My question to you is about what role do documents play in claiming land? These people, as you describe them, are largely undocumented. They only have this card and this thing. What documents then play in their claim to land, in that commission you talked about, the long thing? So if they don't have access to those kind of, what the law has to say, what kind of claims would they be able to make, and what would be recognized as legitimate? I know in the Brazilian case, people's relations to land are often mediated by animals or by, those kinds of things. So what would, in that condition, count as legible and legitimate as a claim? How would they decide that, the group's claims to a piece of land, they want demarcated, I think you call it.
Yeah.
When would that be legible?
The criteria for land demarcation. So you have to establish. So the idea is that. Oh, I'm sorry. We're taking a number of questions. Okay, got it. Yes. Sorry, forgot the rules.
Sorry, Stephen. I see.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really interesting paper. It reminded me of some work I did with Anri Statoy, who works more on issues of agricultural labor, with the program for Land and Agrarian Studies, interesting unit at University of the Western Cape. But we did this small bit of research on farming in the Western Cape, and it was at a time where, around the shift to democracy in South Africa, so mid-90s, and agricultural labor courts were coming into being. So this seemed to be a moment of exercising rights. But what some people who exercised, some workers on farms here who exercised the rights came up against was the informal power of farmers in the area. So they may go to the agricultural labor court, put in a grievance, and then find themselves labeled as troublemakers, obstworkers, etc. throughout the valley, and they wouldn't find work again. So so they bumped up against the limits of rights in quite a profound way. And then that was followed, and people have written about this, it's not my area, of how retrenchments started ratcheting up. Because as you had more rights being granted to agricultural laborers, you had farmers moving people off the farms in the name of empowerment. So you know, now you can have your own house, government low-income house, and you're not under the regime of paternalism anymore. But in a way that was a form of disempowerment, because even within the logic of paternalism, you can make certain claims that you can't when you're now meant to be on your own, either with a job or without a job. So rights without labor. And so I won't go on, because just to add, finally, there was a term that people used when they were on the farm. They said, for instance, deelplandiplaas. We're part of the farm as agricultural laborers, therefore we can make certain claims through the paternalistic logic that you can't within a strict contractual relationship where the farmer can really sever ties. You now, your children and their problems are not my problem. And so I'm wondering how this works out in terms of these documents that were intended, I think, to empower, right? Yeah.
Other questions? So, I mean, I was struck by so much in the talk, but one of the, I mean, one place that would be interesting to go for me would be around some of your very poetic, elegant theoretical engagements with history, and the sense that sort of history hasn't really happened, or it's continuing to happen. And I'd perhaps like you to elaborate on that, particularly in relation to questions of colonialism or neocolonialism, as you call it, and particularly in relation to the kind of the sense that the past is not even past. What are the stakes of that claim vis-a-vis, and I think this pertains to Eli's question a little, that this might be a new moment in Brazil. To what extent, that you've had, and I don't know this as well as some people in the room, and certainly not as well as you, but you've had Lula, you've had Dilma, you've had the declaration of a kind of post-dictatorship democratic moment, a sense of a workers' state. What does it mean to sort of say that these processes of neocolonialism, of re-racializing or once again racializing these populations are ongoing, and what are the stakes of that? And by the way, the kind of the unseen and the hyperseen, I thought this was a really, really, very powerful way of capturing this dynamic. So.
Yeah.
Any more questions at this moment? Okay.
Okay. So, okay, a lot to think about. Again, great. I don't mean that sarcastically, like, oh, great. No, it's great, thank you. So, the question about what renders a land claim legible, or what's the criteria? I believe that was more or less what you were asking. I believe.
For a bureaucracy that kind of deals with documents and the kinds of stuff that is withheld from people that you work with, and are holding these captive networks.
The criteria, and I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question. The criteria is that for those who are squatting on land, for them they have to be able to trace their biographies back to the land, and to show that land significance, that land is necessary for them, for their ongoing reproduction of themselves as indigenous people. So that might involve, for example, a part of the landscape where they have some sort of ancestral or spiritual connection to an aspect of the landscape, according to their cosmological tradition, but also because they grew up there, they're from that place, they have this history of these relations with that place, which is also inhabited by their whatever type of cosmological implications that they are bringing to bear in their claim. And so, so it's both kind of like a biographical, but also a cultural claim to the significance of the place for them, like their ties to that place. And they establish this through testimonies to anthropologists, but also they carry around folders of documents themselves, of photographs, of the maps that they've drawn, of their own stories and narrations. Talking to folks, talking to folks who are making these claims. It's not long before they'll bring out their binder, their folder, and start presenting their case. At least the folks that I was working with, and so that's a part of this, the kind of trying to make legible, sort of create some sort of tangibility, tangibleness. I don't know if that's the word actually. Something to make tangible what they are proclaiming. Is that more or less what you're asking? I hope that's sort of getting at the role of kind of documentation, and even the identification as indigenous people, which predates this more recent push to forever more documentation, right, which would facilitate access to health and healthcare and work in full citizenship, so-called. You had this card that that designates you as an indigenous person, and then there's a different set of rights or a category within the state that then applies to you. So even as regards to crime, you are subject to different criteria for investigation and prosecution that what an anthropologist would mediate, that would interpret culturally your experience of a relationship to the law versus a non-indigenous person. So there's ways that these types of documents or designations via documents mediated by the state have long played a role, and this expansion of it towards the so-called benefit of indigenous people is, I'm just trying to think that this is somewhat problematic, right? Given all that's taking place. Hopefully that was helps clarify the question or speak to the question. Your question about the types of transformations that were occurring in the Western Cape is, I would love to get from you some literature, some references to better understand.
What I'm getting is the ambiguity of ambivalence of rights. So this documentary process, I assume, was meant to empower workers in Brazil.
Yeah.
But it has all these unintended outcomes. It's a general question.
Well, I think, so certainly it's very complicated, the types of histories of the different people that I'm describing, and their point of view regarding a shift to the type of expansion of reservations and who gets what land is quite fractured and splintered. There's by no means a uniform indigenous advocacy for expanded land demarcation because of the consequences. And it's controversial to say this, but I'm just trying to accord to these people the complexity and divergences of experiences and political points of view that I have witnessed and that they deserve. I mean, this kind of and that they are denied because of the insistence, for good, well-intentioned reasons, but the insistence on indigenous law or indigenous rights in Brazil to kind of idealize and almost and pretty much folklorize an indigenous subject, political subject. But there is a tremendous amount of, there is some degree, I'm not going to say tremendous amount, there is some degree of disagreement about about the effects, the possible effects, and what have already been the effects of expanded land demarcation. Some of the, and it's certainly the case that there were a lot of different ways of occupying the land and even being rural laborers prior to this agro-industrial moment that were transformed by these new kind of relations of gato, merchant, agribusiness firm that I have described. So I work with people of an older generation who worked for who worked on, informally worked on plantations, in the types of paternalistic relations you're describing, the same as non-Indigenous people, as sort of peons. And I also work with folks who lived off reservation, who were displaced from areas violently, who were planting, etc., and who they had white people show up with guns and say, move it along, go find somewhere else to live, and found themselves on the reservation. So the kinds of relations between landowners and land occupiers, again, I'm answering the question by saying it's complicated, but there were different. I did talk with people who had these kind of paternalistic relations with white landowners previously, who found themselves in different life circumstances because of these sort of larger transformations that I described in expansion of agribusiness. And I talked to folks who were effectively squatters, had no title, but were living in rural areas and family organizations at prior moments. I talked to people Indigenous folks who are skeptical of further land demarcation because of the impact on jobs, the availability of jobs. If agribusiness has fewer land, there's fewer jobs, and so there's a lot of complicated mixes of experiences in terms of land occupation, land tenure, and land ownership that people involved in this conflict now have. Is that more or less speaking to your question? I hope so. And then the question about ways of understanding and or epistemology and ontology, right? What one knows, what one sees, and then what is, what being or what comes to be or becoming, right? Is in the role of history in this is something that I will think out loud about as well. There's perhaps it's obvious that I feel that there's tremendous stakes for conceptualizing these issues in this way. It certainly creates a conflict or contrast with what I've already sort of described as a way of doing Indigenous politics, whereby Indigenous political subjectivity that's required by the terms for politics is one that is a repetition of some type of prior Indigenous sort of worldview, right? I guess what we would call a sort of structuralist conception of culture, and where there is really effectively, Levi-Strauss would say explicitly, there is no subject. There is no subject, right? There's only sort of this structure that people constantly try to recreate or reproduce, and they have this way of being that is a way of sort of conceiving, of understanding, that they are, despite and through tremendous upheavals and changes and transformations, are continuously trying to put that together. And Indigenous land law, written by anthropologists to a certain extraordinary degree, conceives of an Indigenous political subjectivity whereby the role of the state is to facilitate their ability to go about that work, right? To go about through land, to have the capacity to reproduce their culture, to do this work that is a worldview or culture with no subject, but this is continuously recreating this structure, right? And so when I conceptualize understanding, knowing how one conceives the mind, right, and the material what we call objective reality, material relation, when I conceptualize it in this way, I am deliberately contrasting with the terms for Indigenous politics as they are prescribed in Indigenous land law. And through this approach in anthropology of thinking about culture and land and people in this way, though well-intentioned, though well-meaning, this approach is trying to protect, and to restore land that has been violently withheld, taken, and then withheld by very powerful interests and by prevailing sentiment about what I describe as antipathy within Brazil. So it's very well-intentioned, this conception of indigenous politics as it's been put forth and continues to be defended by anthropologists, sort of structuralist anthropologists in Brazil. But to conceive of it in this other way that I'm describing, this history that is reproduced unbeknownst, somehow unwittingly, which is a condition of racialized subjugation through land and labor. To think of it this way, as this history of racialized subjugation that is being somehow reinstituted, reproduced through this kind of relation of the objective reality being material relations, and a way of perceiving that is sort of hides the objective reality from ourselves. To do that is to try to put indigenous politics on a different footing. And the stakes of that, this past that is not past, it kind of opens up a type of space for politics whereby they are not required to make a land claim in which the criteria is, they need it for their cultural reproduction. If this relation of materiality or material relations, what is, and perception, of the mind is, as I'm offering it, this different kind of framework, the stakes for land is not because one needs land as an indigenous person to reproduce oneself as an indigenous person who has this certain kind of cultural worldview of cosmological relations. But the stakes for land and the basis of the claim is to rupture, to break the repetition and reproduction of this explicitly, though not perceived as such, racialized dispossession, by which one continuously finds oneself having enslaved, coerced, and so on and so forth. And it's a different, that difference has tremendous consequences and tremendous stakes, and it allows for a different footing for politics. And not just indigenous politics, but certainly indigenous politics, but also the question about race and nation and racism, and how we can think differently about what's happening, whereby the society is and has always been racist, and therefore how does one redress that? It's also on a different footing. So that's for me is the stakes for it.
So, thank you. Those are great answers. Are there any last comments? We are over time, but it's been such an engaging seminar, and I'm hoping if anybody has any final questions that they can have the floor. Are there any final questions? Okay. I'd like on behalf of the department to really thank you, and I hope you found it as helpful and worthwhile as we found it. So thanks so much.
It's fantastic. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.